Did you all know that Texas hasn't always been as big as it is today? The current size of Texas is partly due to my great grandma Pearl and my great uncle Claude and their constant squabbling. I'll get to that in a minute. Texas is a big place, proper big, 268,597 miles to be exact. Think of it as a lunchbox with enough space to slot in an Oklahoma, an Arkansas, and two Floridas with enough room left over to fit in all of Maryland. They said that Pearl was like a southern peach, all sweet and fragrant on the outside, but with a hard little stone at the heart of it. Great Grandma Pearl and Great Uncle Claude were called the Hill Twins on account of their family name was Hill and they were twins. There was no end to their squabbling, and never had there been. When they were children, if Claude blackened Pearl's left eye, she would blacken his right eye. If Claude put a snake in Pearl's bed, she put a tarantula in his pocket. Even their mother, a strong, tough-minded pioneer woman, couldn't stop Claude and Pearl from squabbling. The family's land was modest-sized ranch by Texas standards, not much more than 130,000 acres. If you're not sure how big that is, imagine that you have 3 Washington, D.C.s, and you squish them all up together like a legislative lump of pie pastry, and then you roll it out thin. The area covered by that governmental biscuit crust is the size of the family's land. In her will, Claude and Pearl's mother left each sibling a tract of that land. She gave Claude the bigger portion with a big family home on it. She gave Pearl the smaller portion with the much smaller gatehouse and dower house on it, but she gave Pearl the big trees. California may boast of its giant redwoods, and those are handsome trees, I'll allow. But the family's trees were giants on a Texas scale. Those trees were already present when Spanish explorers first saw the territory. They were already there when the native Tonkawa people arose. Some people said that it was God himself who planted those trees in Texas when he ran out of space in the Garden of Eden. Some even said that the trees marked the end of Tornado Alley. And by the time a twister had trounced Tecumseh and thrashed Topeka and Tulsa, it was fair tuckered. There was no storm could topple those trees, so tornadoes just gave up. Some of those trees were so old and so big that they were all spread out with hollow centers. People had cut doors into the trunk so you could use them as buildings. The old church house was a living tree, and so was the schoolhouse. Some trees were so tall that the clouds would get tangled in their upper branches like threads of cotton candy round a cone, and it made them stay put and drop their rain. There was more rain in the area of Los Gigantes than in any other part of the prairie. And if the rain didn't fall, Pearl could climb to the top of a tree with a mop and a bucket, mop up the clouds, and use the water to water the garden. We should cut down those old trees, sell the timber, and open the ground for grazing, Claude would say. Those trees are a legacy, Pearl. I need you to preserve them and care for them, Pearl's mother would say. Now, you might think that the siblings would stop squabbling once they were full grown and were landowners with adult responsibilities, but no. Claude stole Pearl's laundry from the clothesline and buried her things in the coal cellar. Pearl fed oats and lupins to Claude's favorite horse before he rode into town once. Claude put rabbits into Pearl's garden. She introduced his 5 best cowboys to a man who would pay them a better wage. Claude set a fox among Pearl's hens and turkeys. Pearl sowed bindweed in Claude's wheat field. They say that on a terrible hot day in a terrible hot summer, the devil took hold of Claude. He sent away to Canada for some big, big saw blades. Now, once the devil had his claws in Claude, he didn't let go. even as the oven-like summer gave way to the warming tray autumn and then to the tepid winter. In mid-January, Claude received a wagon load of big, long, mysterious parcels, which he promptly hid in a barn. At that time, it was not considered proper for a woman to live by herself, and Pearl shared the dower house with her dear cousin Ruby, who loved to enter contests. Hardly a week went by without Ruby submitting a poem or an essay or a recipe to some contest or another. Once or sometimes twice a year, she would win something. Usually it was something small, but sometimes it was something big, like a year's supply of candles or $50, which was a respectable sum of money in those days. In late January, Ruby received a letter congratulating her on winning this year's Featherlight Flower Grand Prize, and all expenses trip for two to New Orleans to experience the Mardi Gras festival. Now, Ruby didn't recall entering any such contest, but she was so happy to be a grand prize winner that she didn't fuss. It might have helped if she had fussed. Then again, it might not have. But if she had, she might have learned that there was no Featherlight Flower Company, and she might have learned that a man who signed himself C. Hill had bought the tickets and made all the arrangements. Well, Pearl refused to go to New Orleans at first, but Ruby begged and Ruby pleaded, and Ruby pointed out that Pearl could easily hire a man to take care of turkeys and chickens for 2 weeks while she and Pearl were in New Orleans. So in mid-February, a neighbor drove Pearl and Ruby to the station, from where they set off in a glistening fancy rail car towards Louisiana. Once he was certain that his sister and his cousin were out of the way for 14 days, Claude put his nefarious plan into action. He bribed Pearl's hired man to look the other way. Then he hired some men to wield those huge saw blades that he had ordered. One by one, the men cut down every one of those big trees. But that wasn't enough for Claude. He used barrels of dynamite to blow up all the stumps. Now, a tree so big that you can use its heart for a chapel will have mighty big roots that go deep into the soil. Claude, though, was like a man possessed, a man with no care for safety. So many barrels he used, so many explosions he created. Claude and his dynamite shook up the land so bad that it became like so much prairie pancake batter. It spread out flat, pushing the rest of the state ahead of it. The Texas tidal wave took a big bite out of Oklahoma, and it nibbled a little bitty corner off of Arkansas. It even took a thin slice out of Louisiana by making the Sabine River go all wiggly. "Sir, what are you going to do with all this wood?" one of the hired men asked Claude. "I'm going to build a house on the edge of my property, for no better reason than to block all the sunlight from my sister's garden," said Claude. That didn't happen, though, because it takes a long time to fell a tree the size of a schoolhouse, not to mention several of them. Certainly not to mention blowing up its roots, not to mention several of them. All the cutting things down and blowing things up took the whole 2 weeks. When Pearl and Ruby returned to Los Gigantes, they rushed straight to Pearl's property. Pastor Michaels was already there, walking among the trunks and the craters, surveying the damage with a serious look on his face. When Pearl saw the devastation, she became like a statue. She stood completely still, all color gone from her face. When she did move again, she walked on stiff legs like a doll. She moved across the disaster area that once had been a forest. My trees, she said, so quietly that it was hardly audible. He has killed every one of them, even the babies. She fell to her knees by the side of one huge horizontal trunk and gripped at the bark with her fingers. He is going to pay for this. I will rain hell on him. Pastor Michaels walked over to her. Pearl, he said, you need to stand up now. His voice was kind but firm. Pearl seemed to ignore him. I am going to tell you two things, Pearl, said Pastor Michaels, that you do not want to hear, but both must be said. Slowly, Pearl rose to her feet. Pastor Michaels spoke to her again in his firm but gentle voice. Look around you, Pearl, and tell me, was it love and compassion that killed these trees, or was it wrath and avarice? There was a pause. It was wrath, Pastor Michael, said Pearl. The sin is not yours to avenge, Pearl. Plants and animals and birds and bugs all depended on those trees. Other people needed them and loved them. They were a legacy to benefit the whole county, said Pastor Michaels. He continued, this may seem impossible now, Pearl, but I need you to turn your heart away from vengeance and toward recovery and rebuilding. If that seems like more than you can do, then let us help you. Remember, the whole town has suffered great losses. You are not alone in your grief. Ruby succeeded in guiding Pearl back to the dower house, but could not persuade her to either eat or drink or sleep. Instead, Pearl alternated between praying and crying. I should have seen this coming, Ruby, said Pearl, between a session of prayer and a bout of tears. If only I'd been more vigilant. If only I'd stayed at home and not left them behind. If only I'd set a watchman or erected some kind of fence. Later on in the night, Pearl buried her hands and said, I am a failure, Ruby. Mama always told me to preserve those trees as a legacy. She left those trees to me so that I could care for them and protect them, and now they're gone, and it's due to my failure. And then she set to crying until it hurt to cry, after which she began praying again. In the morning, Pearl rose and washed and put on a good dress. She and Ruby spoke to Pastor Michaels and the ladies of the Altar Guild. Together, they arranged to hold a church potluck for the whole town. And if that sounds strange or illogical, then you are probably from a big city in the north. I'm just saying. At the potluck, Pearl learned what happened to the town when the trees came down and the dynamite went off. The tremors caused important stores of food set aside for the winter to fall down from shelves and spill their contents onto the floors. Likewise, bottles and jars of medicine. Windows shattered, brick ovens and clay ovens split. Foundations cracked and buildings settled unevenly, warping planks and posts. Animals, wild and domestic, took fright and ran away. Each story of loss and damage made Pearl's heart a little bit softer. 12 hours before, she'd been ready to raise the devil to quench her desire for vengeance. Now she wanted nothing more than to somehow heal the hurts of this community. Ladies and gentlemen, said Pearl during the dessert course, my heart breaks when I learn what you have endured these past 2 weeks. As Pastor Michaels has pointed out, all of us have suffered losses. Our beautiful trees are gone now. Nothing can change that. But we can still decide whether to rebuild our hometown or cut our losses and move on. I personally vote to cut our losses. Look around you. No longer do we have an oasis of growth in a vast empty prairie. Without the trees, there will be nothing here but red dirt and sagebrush. And without the trees, we can hardly call ourselves Los Gigantes. There was some general discussion at the various tables. And to be fair, strong points were made on both sides. Perhaps our first decision should be, what are we going to do with all of this timber? Pearl asked. By the time the last piece of pecan pie had been eaten and the last glass of sweet tea consumed, they decided to sell the trees for lumber. And so it was that big teams of professional lumbermen came to Los Gigantes, bringing rather big machines on rather big wagons pulled by big teams of big horses. The lumbermen sawed and they chopped all the hours that there was daylight. Ruby and Pearl made certain that every man got a good breakfast and a good lunch. Oh, 1 month before, Pearl would not have been so kind or so generous. But now, as she said, if poachers leave a big mess of your stock in the meadow, be grateful that the condors will come and clean it up for you. And who knows, she continued, perhaps the trees we have lost can become a church or a school or a livelihood for someone else in another town. It may sound at this point as if Claude has won the game with his deceit and his betrayal. He's cleared the land of trees. Pearl appears to be accepting defeat. She's talking about giving up and selling out, perhaps even moving away. This is what Claude wanted, and it is how he wanted it. But bear with me. First of all, where is Claude while all this sawing and hewing is taking place? Him? He's in the county jail waiting for the circuit court magistrate to set his bail. You see, a small handful of surrounding towns are charging him with a multitude of offenses, such as damage to property, loss of livelihood, and discharging explosives without a proper permit. While Claude sat in the jail, listening to the guard learning to play the piano, the lumber company deposited a payment into Pearl's bank account, a very big payment. Pearl put her property on the market and eventually found a buyer who understood that despite everything he had been told about Texas, there was no oil under the ground in this location. Pearl said to the townspeople, what's done is done, and what's gone is gone. It's time to move on and do the next right thing. Pearl and Ruby packed up the few things that hadn't been destroyed in the explosions. And when they left, everyone went with them. The whole town of Los Gigantes picked up whatever still had value. They pitched up their horses and their oxen, and they all drove away. The former residents of Los Gigantes kept on driving, and they didn't stop until they came to the Texas Hill Country, where they rejoiced to see lakes and rivers. They staked their claims, and they built themselves a whole new town. Pearl planted some new trees. Well, these were medium-sized trees, some peaches, pecans, and pears. But they began a new legacy for the benefit of future generations. She married Pastor Michaels. They kept themselves happy by being unselfish toward others and being grateful for the good things they had. And Claude? Claude reveled in his victory for over a year. Often he would go up onto the widow's walk on the roof of the old house and gaze over the flat landscape of red dirt and sagebrush and craters where once there had been trees. So much for Pearl and his precious trees, he said, and he was a happy man. Until the tornado came. But that's another story. Thank you.